Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining me for an afternoon author event, which is always fun. I apologize, we were about 60 seconds late there. That is on me. I had a minor technical difficulty, but now we are good. So today, I'm joined by author Adrian Tchaikovsky. So Adrian Tchaikovsky is the author of Children of Time, Children of Ruin, and many other novels, novellas, and short stories, including one of my personal favorite series, Shadows of the Apt. Children of Time won the Arthur C. Clarke Award in its 30th anniversary year. His newest book, The Doors of Eden, is available now. You can connect with Adrian on his website at shadowsoftheapt.com. So Adrian, first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to come here and talk with me about your book today.
No, not at all. Thank you for asking.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. So, to start us off, why don't you tell us a little bit about The Doors of Eden? I know we were talking about it before the show, but not everyone may have read it yet.
Okay, so The Doors of Eden is a kind of espionage thriller crossed with parallel worlds and evolutionary deep time. It's got lots of strange creatures that have evolved along different paths to the ones that we know. It's got people chasing each other around under London with guns. It's got all sorts of things, but it's mostly it's been an excuse for me to explore parallel evolution and speculative evolution through the medium of science fiction.
So when you say parallel evolution, what does that mean exactly?
So, I mean, one of the big inspirations for me, there's a book called Wonderful Life by a chap called Stephen Jay Gould, which talks about a very early period in world history called the Cambrian Explosion, when the earliest forms of life that we recognize as being groups that we see around today can be found in the fossil record. And his suggestion is there's absolutely no guarantee that if you ran the clock again, you'd get the same things surviving and the same things dying out, because there are a lot of forms there that don't particularly resemble anything we currently know. And so it's really just that idea taken at a series of snapshots throughout history of, well, what if things had gone differently here? What if things had gone differently here? And then you run on, and in each of these examples in the book, it does end up with a sentient race on the planet at some point, and then things go wildly differently as these different intelligent species deal with the trials and tribulations of all the things that happen to the Earth between then and now, including things like the asteroid that struck the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, and all the ice ages and all the other problems that we've kind of squeaked through, or our ancestors have squeaked through, rather.
Sure. One of the other things that I noticed with this book and with several of your books is that science, evolution, and in particular, I'd say in particular science, play a role in them, which is really interesting in fantasy and often in science fiction as well, because it feels like those genres sometimes do the hand wave with science. They go, here's kind of how that works. It doesn't really matter. Just look at the shiny thing, go play with the shiny thing. And you very much don't seem to do that, which I think is part of what drew me to your books and what draws a lot of people. Is that an intentional decision? And if so, where does that come from?
Well, I've got a science background. I mean, what I would say is, if you're writing fantasy, certainly there isn't an explicit need for this at all. It's certainly something that pleases me to do, and I very much like to read it in books as well. And I'm certainly not the only writer who, when I turn to fantasy, I try and put a bit of that kind of logic. And it may seem odd to have, how are you getting anything scientific in a world with magic? But it's the scientific approach, the idea that even if the world works to different rules, those rules are something that the people in that world are trying to understand, and the history of that world is something they're trying to unravel. And so that kind of approach, where you have the idea that this world has a history, and the history makes sense even if it's not on the page of the book, which frequently it isn't, because that would double the length, gives me much more satisfaction when I'm writing the book, that I feel the world has that kind of reality to it. And also, because you said N.K. Jemisin does it with the fifth season books. Stephen Erickson does it with the Malazan books. You have that sense that this is a world that has a lot of deep time to it that isn't necessarily explicitly laid out. But it's a bit like standing on very solid ground rather than on a boat. You feel you've got that that reality to it, which hopefully adds a lot of immersion for the reader.
Absolutely. And I would also tell you that I think that your books do a wonderful job of giving the impression and reminding us as readers that the world goes on past the characters, or it continues past them. So with this book, with Doors of Eden, you've got 6 point of view characters, and I guess 7 because there's an interlude that's kind of there. But you make the world feel persistent, and it's nice because in the real world, when I go to sleep at night, I wake up and things have happened. I don't just wake up and the world goes, he's awake again, turn it on, get the lights on, let's do all the things. What are some of the ways that you're able to do that and to make it feel persistent?
I think a lot of it comes out of my writing process. I'm certainly not unique, but I think I'm relatively unusual in that when I'm writing a book, I always start with the world. And run those experiments of what would it be like if science fiction. By the time I actually put pen to paper on things that will be in the book, I've got a fairly solid understanding of how everything works, what societies, what cultures, what beliefs, what people, if there's magic, what the magic does, if I'm doing things with scientific laws, I've hopefully at least done my homework on that front as well. And I think this does lend a certain air of verisimilitude to a world which a lot of people go to fantasy for. It's one of those things, people think, would you like to live in Middle-earth? Would you like to live in Amber? Would you like to live in Earthsea? Mm-hmm. These are places that when people read, they take them away with them as if it's almost as if it's somewhere you've genuinely visited because your mind has spent that long there. And I think that is the great opportunity you have when you're writing fantasy and science fiction, in that you're creating a place that people can genuinely visit. And if you've done your work properly, it's a place that feels real for the duration of your visit there.
So is that process in particular difficult for you with this book? Because part of what we're dealing with in Doors of Eden, and I try relatively, and I as people can attest, I don't do it perfectly, but I try relatively to keep these spoiler light, because I don't think you can do it spoiler free, but spoiler light. Was it hard to do here when you're telling a story about parallel Earths, where you're going to have a lot of different worlds that are in some ways similar and in some ways very different?
It's going to sound trite, but actually, I mean, a lot of this story is set in modern day, real world London. And the sections set in London were so much harder.
Really?
The sections set in alternate timelines where there wasn't a London and where giant sort of cephalopods or birdmen or whatever had evolved to fill the niche of that humans have in our timeline, because London exists, and that means someone else can check my working. And so rather than having a bit of a free hand, what if this happens, what if that happens, I had to basically spend quite some time trekking around London, or at least the parts of it I wanted to use, and seeing what the street layout was and what was in various galleries of the Natural History Museum, because some of the action takes place there, and all of this. And it was a lot of work, and I'm probably going to try and avoid writing things set in the real world. Compared to that, writing things set in imagined timelines, for me at least, is an absolute joy, because I can just... it's a bit like you kind of feel you're setting the first domino off, and then the logical process of my imagination will basically show me where all the dominoes go. If I want to, from the starter point of view of, all right, I'm looking at a species of rodent, how might that get to become a kind of an evolved human level civilization? I know enough about the biology and the evolution to just let my imagination run, and I have faith in myself that I'll get somewhere which is at least scientifically plausible.
I think it's interesting that London was harder. I think that makes complete sense, because obviously someone can say, that's not how, there's not a chip shop on this side of the road. It's down the corner and wrong. That's wrong. I can understand that. It would never have occurred to me that would be the more difficult part, though. So let's talk a little bit about characters. You wrote, like I said, arguably six point of view characters. And they weren't all, stock characters, so to speak. You have a spy. You have a researcher and a physicist. You have someone who's experienced trauma as a child and trying to unravel a mystery on their own. You've got a wide range of people. So I guess my question I always ask when someone writes like that, how do you keep everyone's voices feeling so original, especially when, I feel like sometimes in like military fantasy, for example, yes, there are 6 points of view, but they're all generals, and so you make them sound different, but they're all generals. How do you do that when they're very different people?
Well, I mean, I think if the more different your starting points, the easier it is to keep them separate, I'd have thought. I mean, I think it would be, if I decided that I'm writing from the point of view of 6 different spies dealing with this, which would have been an entirely reasonable way of approaching the plot of the book in a weird kind of way. I think it would have been less interesting, but you could have done it entirely from the espionage game style thing. But I think it would have been hard to do. I don't know how many of your audience are familiar with role-playing games, for example.
I would imagine that a decent number of them are, knowing some of them like I do.
So you do get some role-playing games where you're kind of shoehorned into a role. So you're all playing Colonial Marines, or you're all playing one particular thing. And at that point, you've got the difficulty of, well, all right, if these characters are good at what they do, they are going to converge a great deal in attitude and skill set, and to the point where you have a danger of them becoming fairly interchangeable, and the only way to get out of that would be to compromise your ability to contribute to your team, because you're adding flaws to make yourself a more interesting character. And it would be the same if you're writing from the point of view of half a dozen people in the same game, basically in a book, in the same trade rather.
Sure.
But more than that, I mean, and weirdly, this is also a role-playing thing, but I've been playing role-playing games for about, it must be almost 30 years now. One of the things you get to do like that, especially if you run a lot of games, is you become very good at getting this kind of, almost like a mental mask you slip on inside. You think, well, this is this character's mask, and you're wearing that, and then the whole world you're writing from gets seen through a filter of that character's perceptions. And if you push it a bit, you can also start doing the same kind of exercise, but with entirely non-human characters. It just obviously it's a bit of a more distorting lens in a way.
I've never considered it from that perspective, because I've played role-playing games for a while now, and absolutely, I think you do reach a point where you don't have to think about, okay, I am Drew and I am running this character and I'm trying to do the optimal thing and win the adventure, and eventually, you really do slip into what this person would potentially want. But it never occurred to me that would be a process or a way to also approach it from a writing perspective.
And certainly in a book where it's actually, where you're talking about characters who are not from the real world. So in Doors of Eden is a little bit of an exception, because the characters are sort of identifiable to us as people we might conceivably meet. But in other settings where it's a created world or a future world or something like that, that's where that world creation at the beginning comes in. Because if you know the world the characters come from, it gives you a much more stable perspective of saying, well, how do they view the world? What do they think? What do they believe? How do they react to this new character who's been introduced? And if you know the world, you kind of know that automatically without having to stop all the time and think, well, what's their perspective on this?
So, with that being said, then, were there characters that it was harder for you to sort of put that mask on because they were less less similar isn't even the right way to put it, but their approaches and their desires were less in sync with yours, or was it all kind of the same?
So the physicist, Dr. Kahn, probably required a bit more work than the other. I mean, she actually has less point of view sections, mostly because she knows too much for me to be inside her head a great deal of the time. But she's basically a very, very boisterous, loud, extrovert character. She's not at all the kind of the meek scientist character, sort of boffin character you might normally see. Which, as I'm a kind of a cringing introvert most of the time by nature, it's quite difficult to get in the viewpoint of someone who is that punchy in their kind of the personality they're putting out.
Well, since you brought up the scientist, let's talk about the science a little bit, because as you pointed out, you have a science background, and there was a lot of research, I'd imagine, that you did to sort of, and big air quotes here, get the science right when it comes to parallel Earths and parallel universes and divergent timelines. Where do you start, and were there things that you took? How much license did you take with it, I guess, to sort of go, right, there's not really an answer, but this is the answer I'm going to provide? And how did you make those decisions?
I mean, that works on two different levels. On the side of the actual evolution, that's something I've kind of been fascinated by for a very long time. I would consider I'm reasonably up on paleontology, evolution, the history of species on the Earth, and I most certainly read a lot of other speculative evolution, like Dougal Dixon and so forth. So, I mean, honestly, that part of the project was something I've been gearing up to find an excuse to do for a very long time, and this book just proved the perfect excuse for me to go completely wild with it. So that was something I kind of came pre-prepared for. The physics, honestly, I'm not a physicist. I did talk to physicists and get some thoughts from them, but the kind of the high-level physics going on in the book is sufficiently weird that I didn't quite devolve to the point where I was sort of waving my hands and just using the word quantum at regular intervals, but I probably only a few steps off that at various points in the book. It's all terribly speculative, but on the other hand, if you get sufficiently far in the book, you'll realise actually there's a reason why it's working in this rather peculiar way, and there is genuinely a reason of why what is going on is going on. And so hopefully when you get to that point, anyone who knows more about physics than me will at least be mollified and not write me angry letters.
I think if you're getting angry letters from theoretical physicists, you've probably done something kind of right, because you're reaching them at least. It's not like they didn't read it, So let's talk a little bit then about the evolutionary side of this. And you and I talked about this for probably a good half hour before we get started, so we're going to be rehashing some ground, but let's talk about cryptozoology. So for people who may not know what that is, what is cryptozoology?
Okay, so cryptozoology is the idea that various sightings of creatures like, say, sea or lake serpents or Bigfoot or the chupacabra or anything like that have a genuine basis in an actual animal that exists but is sufficiently hard to find for whatever reason, hence the side of it, that it's not genuinely known about. And it's the idea that if you if you look at all of the evidence and anecdotes and so forth, you can kind of construct the idea of the creature that exists in the gap that is surrounded by all of these sort of piecemeal ideas. And it's very common. It's part of the general kind of Fortean view of things. But unlike a lot of Forteana, there's people are frequently trying to construct a genuine scientific narrative to account for sightings of inexplicable or unknown animals.
And what's interesting about that, to me, is as we sort of talked about, that's been something that I've found really fascinating for years and years. And so you brought up a very interesting point, which was sort of the history of cryptozoology as a discipline, as opposed to looking at it as, okay, you have individual scientists who go, well, there's a phenomenon, we can't explain it, and there's a story in the area that kind of explains it, so yeah, we're going to go with that. You told me a little bit about the approach of how nationalism played a role in that as well, especially in the European community. Can you expand on that a little bit here for everyone who wasn't there for you and I talking?
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting this mostly the book I'm currently part of the way through, about how accounts of lake monsters have been analysed, and there are a lot of lake monsters in Europe, as there are in America and everywhere, to be honest. But one of the things that was going on, certainly in the kind of the 19th century, was a rise in nationalism across most of Europe, and one of the ways, in more, not so much in the sense of wanting foreigners out, but in the sense of a lot of places that were part of larger states like the Austro-Hungarian Empire or under the control of sort of distant monarchs, wanted to retain and preserve their own individuality. And one of the ways this happened was people used to go out and they would collect folklore and they would collect music, and so you had kind of very educated people going out and encountering a lot of stories of mermaids and lake monsters, and frequently the stories came in the account of medieval eyewitness testimony of the bishop of such and such was called to this place, and yes, there was a lake monster and it had taken a calf and it did all of these things and he endured it to leave, and so forth and so on. And rather than say this is basically a myth that has been reinterpreted in a particular sort of medieval period in a particular Christian light, they were saying, well, what if there is a creature, a real creature that occurred at that time, and this is the story we need to decode to work out what this creature actually was. And the assumption is that they're taking all of these stories that are basically folklore and trying to interpret them in a very rationalist way, to make mythic creatures into real creatures. And one of the interesting things is that you're kind of making it more and less at the same time, because you're taking a thing that probably doesn't exist and saying, well, this is a thing that did exist and we need to work out what it was. But at the same time, you're also reducing it from a thing of mythic and cultural significance into a thing that is just basically an animal. It's not an animal you're necessarily familiar with, but it's an animal.
Okay. So then, I guess two questions. I'll ask the first part then. I have heard before of Birdmen. That's something that that's a myth that I've come across. I had not heard before of Bodmin Moor. So is that an actual place and an actual tie-in with the cryptozoological phenomena?
Yes, it's actually not for birdmen purposes, but it is quite the big news in British cryptozoology, because there is supposedly a beast of Bodmin, which is one of the many accounts of elusive big cats supposedly on the loose in various places in the country. In this case, they're not. The idea, the cryptozoological explanation is that they are not native big cats that we've somehow failed to notice, but they are individual escapees from kind of menageries or zoos or whatever that have gone wild out in the countryside. But yes, supposedly there was a beast of Bodmin at one point. I'm sure people probably still go looking for traces of the beast of Bodmin. But in this case, the reason that Lee and Mal, the two cryptozoologists, go and on their rather ill-fated journey to Bodmin at the beginning of the book is they found a video of something else. They found a video of some kind of bird-like creature that is plaguing one at the farmer, and they've got some sort of rather shonky security camera footage and so forth, and they go off to investigate that, and it goes very badly for them.
So the follow-up question to that is, now it's a question in three parts. I'm sorry. So the second part of my three-part question is, growing up, or even as an adult, were there any of those stories that really attracted you that you went, oh, that's fascinating, or was there a range of them, or not so much?
When I was growing up, I absolutely ate this stuff up. It was very, very X-Files, I want to believe sort of thing. And most importantly, of all the things I wanted to believe in, I wanted to believe that there were genuine monsters in the world, that there were lake monsters and big feet, and pretty much anything else that anyone ever claimed the existence of, I was absolutely wanting to believe in. And honestly, all the books that were around when I was a kid were very, very invested in people believing in these things. Because one of the things... there's someone I follow on Twitter who's Darren Naish, who is a zoologist. He's at Tet Zoo, TETZOO, I believe, or one of the Bigfoot videos or things like that, and goes into exhaustive detail on the circumstances in which these things arose and the questions that they raised. And you soon realise, when you're looking at these, that actually those books were frankly being profoundly dishonest in the way they present these things, because you find out there's a huge amount of evidence at the time that everyone knew and was saying this is obviously a hoax. Mm-hmm. But by the time it filters through to you in the TV show, on the Sci-Fi Channel, or on, in the book of Mysteries of the Unexplained or whatever, all of that stuff has been stripped out, and you're just left with, yes, here is the crystal skull from the Aztecs or aliens. And it's, no one says, and you can see modern tool markings where the crystal skull was made, because somehow that's not relevant to this narrative they're trying to tell. But yeah, when I was a kid, I was absolutely all over this sort of stuff. And then obviously you do a certain amount of zoology, and you realise that there are serious problems with a lot of these things, in that once you're talking about large creatures, it's almost always large creatures. Mm-hmm. You very seldom get cryptozoology of little things, because no one's interested in that. We always want the big monster. Sure. And once you're talking about large creatures with the breeding population, and a diet and a range, all of these things then tend to fall apart, because even in large wilderness areas, it's very hard to hide a breeding population of very large animals. I mean, interesting, in the last decade, every so often, we do discover a decent-sized mammal, say, that we did not know existed. Mm-hmm. But in almost every case, it's because we were seeing it and think it was something else. There's something else in the area that looked a bit like it. We didn't realise there were two species of this thing. So the idea of there being a thing which doesn't look like anything else in the area, and yet is that elusive, and yet is also the size of a rhinoceros, say, is really, really difficult.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, that was also, especially when you're then trying to make it something. So, for example, there are several cases where what are very obviously the rotting carcasses of large basking sharks turn up, and because of the way a basking shark rots and because of the way it looks, you end up with a thing that looks like it's got a long neck and then a small head on the end. And so, we found the plesiosaur. And people go, we found the plesiosaur. Look, it's a plesiosaur skeleton. Here's a picture of this Japanese fishing boat. It's got this big, rotting plesiosaur hoisted up. And as soon as you start looking, it's obviously a shark. And if someone had said, we found something that's basically, it's like a shark, that would actually be much harder to deal with. But plesiosaurs are reptiles, and reptiles breathe air, and they have to come up to the surface all the time. Mm-hmm. And so the more you try and fit it into that mold, the more difficult you're making it to show how this thing isn't just common currency everywhere and we're eating them in every fish restaurant.
So, it's interesting that you bring up choosing to believe. Because, again, we sort of talked about this earlier, but I think when it comes to cryptozoology, people genuinely, in many cases, choose to believe this. And it begs the question, kind of why? And I guess my question to you is, do people choose to believe this because in a weird way, that's the easy answer? Instead of saying, actually, it's the way that the shark rots and it looks a certain way, or, okay, no, elephant skulls with the tusks removed kind of look like giant people skulls. Is it just easier to say, nope, just giant people. There were giant people, and that is plesiosaur, and also there are Bigfoot. Is that the easier answer, I guess?
I think there are a whole load of different directions people come to this from. I mean, sometimes you have an actual kind of a cultural agenda that if you have a belief system that specifically says yes, there were giants, then it's very useful to have evidence of giants. And there are a whole load of supposed unearthing of giant skeletons and things like that, which were touted this is evidence of things that in our writings. But I think more than that, we will tend to go for a pleasing narrative over what frequently turned out to be a slightly humdrum but more rational story. So the pleasing narrative is, yes, somewhere out there there are sea monsters, rather than, yes, sharks rot really weirdly, unless you're a sort of a shark decay specialist, in which I guess that is your pleasing narrative. But and I mean, I'm not really in a position where I personally believe any of these accounts, although I do always read them. And I read them and find good critical accounts of them where all the evidence is being presented, and they always do fall over. But I wouldn't be heartbroken if someone genuinely brought a living pterodactyl, Professor Challenger style, out of somewhere in the world, or found trilobites on the ocean floor. I mean, that's almost my perfect thing, if we found a living trilobite. Because they're, you kind of think they're not that big, and they're living on the ocean floor somewhere, maybe, and there's a lot of ocean floor, we haven't seen it all, who knows? Yeah. There's some kind of black smoker somewhere which is just encrusted with trilobites, and that would be lovely. But where I think that's the childhood belief is, I think, very much just migrated. Well, fine. Well, if they're not out there, I'm just going to write them. I will fill my world with all the creatures that I want that aren't actually in the real world.
So, in a way, would it be fair to say that the Doors of Eden was your attempt to tell, in part, because it isn't, in part, a true cryptozoology story, and explain away a lot of the issues, like, if there's a bunch of giant animals, why do we never see them? And it's never just one. Was this sort of your way of presenting your own sort of report on it, I guess?
I mean, the weird thing is, obviously I had it in the original plan that, yes, I would start off with this cryptozoology expedition to Bodmin Moor. I hadn't specifically considered, I'll be doing the big cryptozoology story, and I'll be almost kind of one-upping cryptozoology by making it cryptophysics to account for the cryptozoology. But that's where it went, and I think that's my kind of 10-year-old self, basically just getting out and saying, well, hell, if you're doing it, let's do it. Let's really get into it. Let's build this structure where, in this version of our world, there really is a mechanism for those elusive cryptozoology sightings, because things are coming in from elsewhere. And therefore you don't need to have that breeding population, because there is a breeding population, it's just in the world next door, and the occasional individual slips through. And one of the things I heard a while back from the physicist Brian Cox was the idea, he was talking about why he doesn't believe in ghosts, and he was saying one of the reasons is, basically, if you go to, say, the particle accelerator in CERN or something like that, and we've pounded the basic building blocks of the universe into tiny pieces, and you've not found ghosts. And if ghosts exist, then they must have some and if they have interaction with people's senses and things like that, they must have some kind of existence. And if there is no ghost particle, basically, and so one of the things I end up playing with in the Doors of Eden is, well, what if this thing did exist? If you had these parallel worlds, then actually you would see, as the cryptozoological sightings are actually, they are that physical evidence. They are that physical evidence of those other worlds, and in fact, you have various kind of creatures and even societies in the book which have actually grown up exploiting the fact that the parallel universes exist. So that, if you're having a hard time, well, if you go to this place, you know that sometimes you might be able to slip into somewhere which is warmer and greener and has all of these unsuspecting animals you can snag and bring back to eat. And so there's this kind of writing through history of, actually, we have been having these interactions with these other places in the book. So this is, it felt... So there's a lot of noise going on at this end because we're doing our bonfire night, so there's lots of fireworks going on, just in case. I don't know how much is coming out over the mic. as deafening me. But the idea that if you had this kind of paranormal or cryptozoological stuff going on, it's not as if, it's not like one of these settings where, well, yes, there are vampires and there are ghosts, but nobody knows. They've completely evaded, except for maybe one order of vampire hunters. They've completely evaded. They've completely evaded everyone. It's more the idea that if this exists, something will evolve to exploit it. In the same way that I understand that the mechanics of photosynthesis might exploit particular peculiarities of sort of subatomic physics to pull off precisely how it works efficiently. It's one of those, evolution will generally find a way and refine that way. And if that means that because your world has a parallel universe where things are slightly easier to do, evolution is going to lead you there eventually.
So I have a question regarding your writing process. Before I ask it, I have to ask now because I have you just threw a little reference in there that I have no knowledge of at all. Photosynthesis and particle physics. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I am trying to think. I'm looking to see if I can even Google the wretched thing. There we go. Is photosynthesis quantum-ish? That sounds about the level of physics I'm going to be working with.
Five things about photosynthesis that your quantum physicist friends don't want you to know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. This is quite an involved article, so I won't sit there just staring at the screen for 5 minutes. But the details currently escape me. But I believe there's a theory that the biochemical mechanics of photosynthesis effectively exploit quantum uncertainty in some way, or something like that. And I can't remember the details, but that was enough. It's really just what got to me for the book was the principle, just the idea that if ghosts actually exist in the world, and if they are able to exert energy in the world, you'd probably, over the 500 million years of evolution we have, evolve a thing that ate ghosts or was parasitized on ghosts, and then the idea of, well, you could do fascinating things with that in the book. You could have, well, actually, maybe this creepy-looking moss you get in haunted houses, or this particular kind of rot you get, is actually, maybe that's feeding off ghost energy.
Ooh, okay, yeah.
Maybe, and just this whole kind of logic of, rather than having your supernatural thing as a thing that's completely severed from the world, except that it interacts in a very intimate way with people. You say, well, actually, if these things are around, if that's the way, then that's the way the world works. That's your science. And if that's your science, then the world would work in a way consistent with them existing. You would effectively be able to infer the existence of ghosts from the way other things in the world made use of them or were affected by them.
So all I want to do now is write a more scientific-based horror novel. We have a comment in the live stream from Brandon, who says, in particular, according to a study released Monday in Nature Chemistry, an international team of scientists showed that molecules involved in photosynthesis display quantum mechanical behavior. That's interesting.
There we go. I've got here, the wave-like motion of energetic particles through photosynthetic systems enables plants to efficiently counter the sun's energy. So it's the idea that something as tiny as the subatomic interactions of light are then being exploited, are something that plants have evolved to exploit to make their photosynthesis more efficient. Because that's how evolution goes. Because if you get a leg up by some chance way, you are then the one that's putting more offspring to the next generation, and so on and so forth, over the millions of years that we've had.
No, I mean that.
And so, again, if you had ghosts, then you would expect to find effectively an ecosystem based off ghosts. And for that matter, if there is a Bigfoot out there, then I guarantee you there is a species of flea specifically evolved to live on Bigfoot.
So the key to tracking Bigfoot is not through footprints or through going out there with cameras. It actually is going to come down to looking for the proper flea or tick.
Yeah, or internal parasites, because that's how the world works. Everything has the things that feed on it. everything has its associative ecosystem up to and including us.
Yeah. So changing gears for a moment, and I feel guilty doing it because selfishly I'm like, I could talk about this all day, and we'll probably swing back to it a little. But changing gears for a moment, you mentioned in the writing of Doors of Eden that you started off in one place and the story just kind of took you somewhere else. So I always like to ask people who are writers, because it fascinates me, because I'm not that way. I don't have the discipline to do it, or the talent probably. Are you more of, when you sit down to write a book, when you sit down to write this book, do you have an outline and you go, yep, this is what's going to happen, and these are the beats, and this is the plot points, and this is the clear arc everyone's going on? Do you sort of just scatter the seeds and go, I don't know, something's going to grow, and I'm just going to kind of see how the story takes me? Or is it a combination?
I mean, it is a continuum. I mean, it's one of the you sometimes get people saying, well, you're either at one end or the other end. But it is very much a continuum from sort of, I think planning and pantsing is the two phrases I've heard most often. But I am definitely at the planning end. I couldn't just cast myself out into the void. I have a huge amount of respect for the writers who do that. I feel I need to know where I'm going and I need to nail it all out. And usually the one thing I do not actually determine beforehand is the final resolution.
Oh, okay.
My plan will go right up to the 11th hour, and I'll know who the characters are there and what their agendas are and so forth. But what I will do is then I'll let the momentum the book has built up to that point tell me how it ends. So the actual ending, the actual plan, effectively, that the protagonists cook up to save the day, is the one thing I don't know. And sometimes this doesn't always work out. I mean, frequently I end up tinkering with it on the fly, and then occasionally, including in the middle of the Doors of Eden, it fell off, basically, and I had to basically tinker with it infuriatingly to actually get the midsection to work properly, which is the thing that happens occasionally, but it was always, because I don't tend to do seat of the pants writing, I'm much less prepared for that when it happens. So that's the downside of my process, I think. But yes, no, definitely on the planning end of things. This
is just one of those things. It may be time to actually choose a different encoding software. Okay. All right, everyone who is still there, thank you all so much for hanging out with me. Again, my apologies. Unfortunately, it did require me to restart my stream. So the question that Brandon had asked was, has that momentum ever taken you to a different ending than you had initially intended? And Adrian was giving a great answer, and in sort of keeping with the theme, told us the meaning of life. And unfortunately, you're all going to miss that one. You don't get to know that. Blame technology, but Adrian, if you wouldn't mind answering that again for everyone at home, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. So I was saying one of the more problematic writing elements is if it takes me to a middle I don't like, because you don't tend to think as much about the middle, and therefore you can sometimes the stepping stones I've laid out in my plan turn out to be too far apart or not going where I need them to go, and at that point you get a whole, you feel like you've broken down in the middle of nowhere and you have to sit there and tinker with the car and hope you can get it running in the right direction, and that is the pain, because one of the downsides of my plan heavy process is writing on the fly is not my strong point. And I suspect that changing direction like that mid-narrative is particularly difficult for me. As far as the ending goes, usually I am sufficiently immersed in the book by the time we get to that end point that whatever happens is what needs to happen, and that in itself is satisfactory. And what can happen is characters I think will live will die. Or sometimes vice versa, but usually the dying part. And that can be a bit of a surprise and cause for sadness, but they die because the book's balance needs them to. Basically, it's all. I mean, especially when I'm writing more of a fantasy narrative, you kind of feel sometimes, in order to save the world, you've got to pay your cost. And I've certainly read books where you feel that cost hasn't been paid, and that means the victory feels a bit handed on a plate and a bit easy, and therefore not terribly satisfying to the reader. You've got to feel that the win has been earned, effectively.
Absolutely. I mean, the classic, almost literally classic example is Tolkien. at the end of the Two Towers, you have the Battle of Helm's Deep, where Gandalf basically says, "You don't have to win. Hold out, and I will be there. I'll take care of it." There's a clear expectation, promise, and delivery. Where then later, at the Battle of Pelennor Fields in Return of the King, it all seems lost, and then Aragorn shows up with his ghost army, and yes, there's a reference in the book to him going to them and getting the former traitors of men to come help him, because then they'll be set free. But no one in Gondor, no one at Minas Tirith knows that that's happening. So it does feel less earned. So I think that you're right there for sure. So let me ask you then, as someone who's been writing as much, as long as you have, what advice would you give to a young writer, and what advice would you love to be able to give to yourself when you were first starting out? If you could go back and say, "Listen, Adrian, I'm telling you a couple of things you're going to want to know," what would that look like? As far as giving advice to myself would be, for reasons of time travel paradox, I don't think I would dare. Oh, okay.
Because the moment I start giving myself advice, I would then do different things. It would be fatal for me to go and tell myself, "Yeah, you're going to make it one day," because at that point I'd probably stop trying. I would coast on the assumption that I would at some point be a successful writer, and therefore never become a successful writer. It's a dreadful grandfather paradoxy sort of thing. Mm-hmm. As far as advice to writers, it's really difficult, because I know a lot of the things that work for me are not what other writers do. A lot of the things that work for other writers wouldn't work for me. It's a weirdly personal thing. It's one of those, always keep reading, I would say. Certainly, I still try and read, although I have to say recently that it's been hard to kind of find the calm time just to sit down and do that. Always listen to criticism. If you can, that's one thing I found it very, very hard to do early on, because you write a thing, and I was absolutely convinced that my early books that I was submitting to publishers were gold dust, and they were absolute fools for not taking them on. And I've looked back at them, and they were rubbish. They were absolutely terrible, because it's a craft, and you get good at this thing gradually. The more you do it, the better you get. Other than that, it's just worth knowing it's a very, very luck-dominated business. You submit your manuscript, it will turn up on some editor's desk somewhere. They will be in a particular mood. They may have had a bad day. They may have had a good day. They may have a lot of pressing deadlines. There are vast numbers of things that will affect how that book is received. It would be nice to... I suspect that very few bad books get through that net. I suspect that a lot of good books bounce off many, many times, just because there are thousands of submissions and a very finite number of sort of books that publishers will publish. Obviously now there is also a self-publishing route. That is a perfectly viable way of getting published. What I would say is paying for the services of a professional editor for your self-published book is probably a good move, because getting that, God knows I need editing. I've written about 30 books. I still need an editor to look over my books and tell me where I've gone wrong, because I still do. So getting an editor, getting that extra pair of eyes is really useful. And also paying for a good cover design and cover art is probably worth it, because the problem you have obviously as a self-published author is you don't have anyone other than yourself publicizing your book, and there are a lot of books out there, and the danger is you'll bring out your book, no one will notice, and then it's gone.
Yep.
But there are certainly ways of being extremely successful as a self-published author. There are small presses, there are anthologies, there are a lot of ways to get to the point where you're kind of in people's mental space. And then at that point, you've got a better chance of someone picking something up and saying, "Oh, I know that name. They put out that book. That did quite well. I will spend a little bit of extra time reading this submission or something like that. But beyond that, I guess the big thing is there's absolutely no point getting the best editor on the best day when they've had a phenomenal time and are really raring to go picking up a book. I will publish this book if what you're submitting is not as good as it could be. So give yourself, I mean, it's like a role-playing game. You're rolling a dice, give yourself the best possible modifiers to that dice roll you can, and beyond that you have to trust to luck.
Yeah. I think that's very good advice. I know that, the inclination we all have is to believe that there is no randomness in the universe, and if I just do all the things the right way, then I will get the outcome I want, and clearly, that's because we all view the world from our own lens, and we forget that everyone is out there interacting and doing their own things independently. I'm a full-time writer. I've won some awards. I've got a lot of books out. I was 15 years of not getting published. 15 years of writing books and submitting books and getting the rejection letters through. So it does, it can take like that long, it can take longer. But there are so many variables that you can't control. It's really just down to look at the things you can control, i.e. the quality of the thing you are submitting, control for that, and you're at least giving yourself the absolute best chance. I think that's a good approach in a lot of parts of life. We've got a question from the live stream from Mr. Bear. They want to know, is Shadows of the App basically about how religion ruled the world until science came along and bumped it out of the way a good bit? And the Empire, is that basically the rise of fascist elements that use technology and science made by others, but seem to also use religion? In parentheses, the Sting attacks seem more of an inapt thing as weapons to impose themselves upon everyone else. Also, they would like a Shadows of the App role-playing game.
Oh, well, let's take those in reverse order or semi. Right, Shadows of the App role-playing game is hopefully on its way. It is being developed as we speak. I've been wanting a Shadows of the App role-playing game for a very long time, and so hopefully that will be a thing. Beyond that, we get into the surprisingly complex metaphysics of that world. So for people who don't know it, Shadows of the App was my first series. It's a 10-book fantasy series. It's being re-released this year in the UK at least. New covers and audiobooks for the very first time. I'm very, very excited about that. You have various races of people who are sort of draw powers from insects and arachnids and similar things. Some of these people are technologically capable, some of these people are not. The people who are not have a sort of magical traditions. One of the things they don't tend to have, though, is religion. It's not actually a science and religion thing. It's a science and magic thing, and the main difference there is that the magical traditions are very much about personal control of the world and influence of the world. They're not to do with propitiating anything bigger than you. Or, say, for certain exceptions you do run into in the books. But in general, if you have a magician, they're to do with, well, what can I make the universe do? But there is the idea that the old magical ways are definitely in decline, for reasons that may or may not turn up later in the series. And the technological races are very much in the ascendant, one of which is the Wasp Empire. And yes, the Wasp Empire are absolutely a sort of a fascist supremacist society, and they have various other kingdoms that they have subjugated, and they are absolutely all about taking what those kingdoms can give them and then claiming it for their own. So that part of it you're absolutely on the money with.
Excellent.
Hopefully some of that made sense.
Oh, I think it is. The responses are extreme enthusiasm. I should let you know that the person who asked that question is one of the people who I put that book in their hand. They are a very good friend. They love role-playing games. They have a really, we're going to go with good obsession with insects and arachnids. That's going to be the pivot I take with that, because insects and arachnids oog me a little bit, but they love them. And I remember reading Empire in Black and Gold, or Black and Gold Empire. Empire in Black and Gold? The first
Empire in Black and Gold.
Thank you. I remember reading it and going, Yeah, I know who this is. I've met your ideal reader for this book. The person you didn't realize you were writing the book for, it's him. So yes, I'm glad that he was able to ask one of his questions. And that is incredibly cool that you're doing a role-playing game for that. If you can, what's that process like to kind of sit down? I mean, do you sit down with someone and you go, okay, here's my world, and here's how I think that could translate into classes, or do you just, is it someone, Wizards of the Coast contacts you and they go, we'd like to do this, and you go, cool, what's that like?
Well, I got put in touch with them. I worked with 2 or 3 groups of people on this, and things have fallen through for various reasons. So I've got in touch with these people through a friend who's kind of a games writer, and thought they would be a good match. And beyond that, I basically just dumped a huge amount of material on them, including some stuff I had personally written for some earlier incarnation of the game, just going into the setting and actually just laying it all down and setting out timelines and things like that. So they've had a fair amount of information, but as far as how that translates into game system stuff, that's very much their bag, and I'm quite keen to see what they're going to do with it.
Very cool. Well, I know, and I'll speak for him for a moment. If the day comes and you need a playtester, I can. That's the person you want. He's wonderful and nuts in a good way. So let me ask you then, again, sort of keeping in line with the amount and time over which you've written. Do you read books that came out, 15 years ago that you wrote? Do you read them, or do you just go, I don't want to read them now because I'm a different person and it's going to bother me. I'm going to find all the little inconsistencies and things, and it's going to be a thing.
I will absolutely be listening to the Shadows of the Apt audiobooks when they're, because I'm absolutely shameless for listening to audiobooks of my own work, because you get someone else's take on it, and that's fascinating. And yes, I will absolutely cringe at some of the little bits I put in that I would not do that this way anymore. Because it's been 13 years and I've changed the person as a writer. But and now I've got to the point where I'm not. Remind me what the actual question was, because I'm now just talking.
No, that's fine. Like I said before, this is just a big conversation. The question really was, do you specifically do that? Is that an intentional thing that you try to avoid? Because you go, man, I'm going to read this and I'm going to be, frustrated with myself, or I'm going to want to rewrite it and re-edit it because now I have a new way of thinking about it? Or is it the kind of thing where you actively go and read it because you're like, no, I want to I want to see if there's another nugget here that I go, oh, I never explored this with this book, but that's a really cool idea. Let me bring it over here and put it in this other and see if I can do something with it.
I don't tend to reread my own books other than experiencing them by audio, where I feel I'm getting an extra dimension to them. Mm-hmm. And it's a time thing, to be honest. I mean, I probably would do it if I just had a vast amount of time. But as it is, unless I'm specifically writing something in the same setting, so I have to basically remind myself of some odd details, I'm far more interested in reading other people's books. And so when I have reading time, there's a constant kind of mill of really good books coming out in the world, and I want to keep up with as many of them as possible.
Absolutely. I've got another question from Brandon. This is, he heard earlier that you were a fan of role-playing games, so now we have to ask, what do you think about how board games get blended into digital media / often have app companions? What do you think about that sort of thing in relation to role-playing games?
It's weird. I mean, I guess I'm old enough that it seems weird to me, and it kind of seems an extra level of fuss that the simple physical components of the game don't present. But intellectually, I think it's a good idea. You can do a lot with that sort of thing, and I don't see any reason why you shouldn't have at least sort of optional digital assistance for role-playing games. I mean, obviously at the moment, whatever we're playing online anyway. And there are various sites that exist which provide you with that kind of online support for maps and dice rolling and all manner of stuff anyway. But integrating something like that into a game would be entirely doable. There's been a bit of a rise of GM-less sort of dungeon crawl games, like Iron Sworn Delve is one example I've been told works really well. And obviously, if you have an app that's throwing up random encounters and things like that, then that would you could certainly do that. I think the big problem would be keeping that kind of human level of detail in, because obviously if you are getting something that is purely random, it's hard to make that into a story. You lose that world integrity that we were talking about before, because in the same way as you do when you've got a procedurally generated game, it's very hard to make that game feel like it's got meaning, because everything is kind of being thrown at you randomly. And all right, it's infinite variety, but that's a bit like the infinite chaos at the heat death of the universe is also infinite order. And eventually realize you're just doing kind of the same things in different orders,
sure,
over and over again. And so I think you would run into limits with how much you could really introduce with that kind of app. But I'm sure there are plenty of ways that I am not thinking of that you could use that kind of assistance as part of a regular game.
Yeah, I think that, infinite variety is something that sounds wonderful. If you were to go to a restaurant and they go, we've got 20,000 dipping sauces, you go, oh, 20, yeah. But then the reality is, at a certain point, you either get very weird and you're like, well, I didn't love the celery, sea salt, and aspic dipping sauce. That wasn't for me. Or you go, yes, it's a different kind of ketchup. I get it, but it doesn't matter anymore. So I think that's a perfectly good way to look at it. To bring it back to your writing a little bit, when you sit down and you create these characters, and you said that there's an outline, and then sometimes things kind of go a little different. Do you, when you write a series, is it a different process than when you're writing a standalone book? So, for example, obviously a series, there are, arcs within an individual book, and then arcs that are sort of the overall series arc. Is it harder? Is it easier? Does it just not matter?
Honestly, I've not written enough series to have a hard and fast rule. With The Shadows of the Apt, the first set of 4 books make a complete plot. Then the next 3 are kind of individual plots on their own, and then the final 3 is an arc in itself, and that was very much how that was conceived. And obviously, mostly because it would have been completely insane for me to just go into a publisher and say, hey, I've got to have 10 books, because they would have thrown me out on the street. With the Tiger and the Wolf series, that was very much conceived as, well, here is a book, it'll work happy on its own, but I would rather write it as a series of 3 or 4 books. But I originally wanted 4, and the publisher said, well, right, we're going to do 3. So, cut your cloth to suit your purse. With the Final Architecture, which is my space opera trilogy, which is starting next year, that was definitely going to be a trilogy from the start. And one of the things I do try and do with books that are in a series is I do try and make each book independently satisfying as a reading experience. Because what I do occasionally, you run into books in a series where each book is kind of like it's another chunk of sausage. And the sausage might go on for who knows how long, but there's no real end, there's no real beginning, it's just more of these things happen. And I, as a reader, I find that quite a dispiriting experience, because you get to the end of what is frequently quite a long book, and you think, well, not quite sure what we've achieved there, but it's kind of not been left, right, so-and-so was having a meal, and then they ran out of pages, and then there'll be another book along at some point. So I try and make sure that with The Shadows of the Apt, for example, each of the books has its own specific plot that it's dealing with. It has its own specific denouement and resolution, and usually a fight, frankly, because it's that kind of book. But there is always there's always that shape to the individual book, as well as the shape to the individual sets of books within the series, as well as the shape within the individual series. What that also meant is that book 7 was a nightmare, because I had to kind of tie up all the loose threads from the previous 6 books, foreshadow the stuff from the next 3 books, and also fit a complete plot in there. And that was really hard.
Okay. It wouldn't have occurred to me to approach them in a different way other than kind of the sausage method you were describing? Because what do I know? I would think, you're going to have this. You think of it as a big book, and you have different chapters, and each chapter is its own book. But yeah, that would, at a certain point, I'd imagine that would get very frustrating for a reader.
I think especially as it's frequently, it can be anywhere between 6 months to several years between books, and I as a writer, I feel it problematic, but I kind of understand why some readers might say, well, look, I'm not going to pick up the first book in the series until all of the books are out.
Yes.
Because if you get to that point where I've got to the end of book 3, when's book 4 coming out? We don't know. But at the end of book 3, rather than, yes, there was a great fight and they won this and they lost that and that guy died, it's just, yes, we got to the end of book 3. Nothing particularly happened at the end of book 3. It was just part of this ongoing process. And the overall plot might be phenomenal, but if it's one book that's just 10 volumes of one book with one beginning and one end, and maybe a couple of sort of mid-season climaxes, that's a lot of detail where you're not getting that big payout that you're looking for at the end of a book. Even if you know it's book X of this series, I kind of feel that some sort of payout is a good thing for the readers to have.
Absolutely.
Certainly for myself as a reader, speaking purely for myself as a reader, if I don't get that, you kind of leave thinking, well, okay, what did we learn from that?
Yeah. So my next question is a little bit about, well, let me preface this. I have 2 last big questions. So if you're in the live stream right now and you want to ask a question, you should probably start writing it down or put it in the live stream or think through it and figure out how you want to say it, because we have been on with Adrian with a slight interlude for a little over an hour. And I try very, very hard not to do the 2-hour-long shows that have happened before, because people have lives, and while I'm sure Adrian has been wonderful, I know Adrian has been wonderful in humoring me, at a certain point, I'm sure he would like to go do other things because he is several hours ahead of us. So, with that being said, my penultimate question: writing characters with writing diverse characters. So one of the things that I certainly noticed in Shadows of the Apt, I noticed it in The Doors of Eden, is you did not write, like I said, just traditional English farm boy saves the world. How important was it for you to write those kinds of characters? And how did you, as someone, how did you do that and keep it honest, I guess? As far as keeping it honest, I guess the only fallback there is that I really, really tried to get behind the eyes of the character, and I've done my honest best as someone of the demographic I'm from, and hopefully I've done it okay. As to why I've done it, aside from the fact that there are an awful lot of books out there about the standard farm boy saves the world sort of thing, it's fine, but it's been done a lot, and I always want to feel like I'm doing something new and creating something that hasn't come into the world before. And also, I'm naturally far more interested in a diverse cast because I write books about spiders in space and giant evolved trilobites and things like that. Then that's where my imagination goes. It doesn't tend to go to, yes, this person who looks very much like me will save the world again. Also, there was slight tangent, but there was I think it was a radio program, a UK radio program, where in one of the programs you would get a guest on, the guest would talk about their thing, and then they would nominate the next guest. Basically, they would say, "Well, you should have this person on next." And one of the things they found was that men would basically just not in any sinister way, but purely as a knee-jerk reaction, who will I think about? I'll think about so-and-so, and that would be someone very similar to themselves. Because we've got this society where most films are about people like us doing things, most books are like people like us, and that's just, it becomes a default that probably shouldn't be a default, and therefore, being as I am of this particular demographic, I kind of feel I need to take an extra effort to escape from that default, and in doing so, I feel
you're just going to have a more interesting book if you have a group of people who are, I mean, this is something we were discussing earlier. If you have that greater diversity of characters, it's easier to keep them separate. It's easier to make them more interesting and different, and just have that sort of cast of thousands that fantasy novels especially frequently have. If they are all this, if you have different cultural backpoints and different agendas and different difference, really, and speaking as someone who likes to write from the point of view of things that are very alien, as well as the points of view of various different people, I think that diversity is an essential ingredient to fantasy. We've got a toolkit in fantasy fiction and science fiction that no other genre has, because we have basically no limits. So it seems very weird to just have a tiny little fish pond that you're going round and round and round with castles, kings, cod medieval history, whatever you've got, when you could be doing all of this other stuff instead.
So really, the argument is then that, well, argument isn't the right word. You can make the argument that fantasy is actually the genre to do this with, or sci-fi as well, I suppose, because
the thing is, obviously, the real world that most other genres take place in is also very diverse, and frequently more diverse than the books written about the real world. So that there is a genuine problem there. But I think with the fantasy, you're cutting yourself off from so much possibility simply by treading the same paths that previous writers have trodden. And there's nothing wrong with those paths, but they are trodden. And fantasy gives you the opportunity to explore an infinite number of other worlds. They don't all have to look like this one, or especially they don't all have to look like the way we think this one looked 600 years ago, but probably didn't.
As a historian, I love that answer, because there's nothing I quite like as much as someone saying, "Well, it's just how the world looked," and you're like, but it really didn't. It was never that monotone. It's always been kind of complex. As I sort of said before we even got started, the whole what is it? History Channel, or as I call it, aliens must have built that. There's always this conceit. They're like, "Oh, look, all of these cultures who never interacted have the same myths, so therefore there must be a single source." And it's like, they all not all, but they interacted. The Han Dynasty in China acknowledged that there was a Roman Empire. They didn't call it the Roman Empire. They just were like, "Yep, there's a group of people over there. We don't really, but they're there," and they trade with them, and vice versa. So I think that I love your sentiment. That's a beautiful way of looking at how fantasy is and can be and what it can do. And so for my ultimate question, and for what it's worth, I'm looking in the live stream. Apparently everyone, their brains are fried at the idea that there's going to be a Shadows of the App role-playing game. So that you have made days. I can only speak for one of them. I can only speak for Brandon. I know that he has tried his hand at creating that role-playing game several times, and I know that as someone who's playtested that game for him several times. So I'm excited too to see what this is going to look like. So for my ultimate question, I guess it's this. Rather than ask you who you're reading right now, or what you've been doing to kind of keep sane as we have been in lockdown, out of lockdown, and potentially in lockdown again, as I understand, rather than ask those, what do you hope that people can take away from your books? What's something that you go, if I only get one thing across, if they only do one thing, what's that? What do you want that to be?
I think the big thing, and this is very much in the Doors of Eden, it's very much in the Children of Time, the big thing is empathy for the different. I think the big lesson is that the world is stronger because of a union of differences. rather than stronger by just simply clutching what you know to yourself. And that's, as I say, it's very much the message of Children of Time. It's very much the message of Doors of Eden. It's that, in the same way that if you have a genetically limited population, you're basically all going to die from the next disease that turns up. And it's that genetic variance that gives you the ability to resist things. Intellectually and ideas-wise, it's exactly the same way. You need that variety of thought. If we are going to survive, I mean, getting serious, well, if we're going to survive as a species for any length of time with all the things we're facing, you need that variety of thought. You need to be able to accept people who think differently and believe differently, and treat them as people, which shouldn't be hard, but seems to be.
Yeah, I think that's a really, again, that's a wonderful sentiment. So, a slight shameless plug, not to bring us out of the hopeful, but you can get copies of The Doors of Eden at Town Book Center. We are located in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. And if you don't live in Collegeville, or if you don't live in Pennsylvania, or if you go, I don't need to leave my home, you can always shop with us online at townbookcenter.com, or townbc.com. That is TOWN as in Nike, E as in Echo, B as in Bravo, C as in Charlie.com. And you can always order Doors of Eden from us through our website. And a quick shout out, if you also go, gee, I'm going to get this book, but also I love audiobooks, you can still support a local bookstore. Libro is the local bookstore equivalent to Audible. It is the same audiobooks, it's the same narrators, it is literally the same audio file, but instead of Amazon getting a percentage of the money, your friendly local bookstore does. So, with that in mind, Adrian, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and for, giving really, I feel, very heartfelt answers at the end there. I know we kind of pivoted and went away from goofy fun sci-fi and into, like, what are the things in the world, but I enjoyed doing that.
Thank you.
And to everyone watching at home, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time. Stay safe.